A storm doesn't always begin with thunder. Sometimes it starts with a whisper, a warning spoken behind a closed door, a name muttered with disdain, or a family member's gaze held just a moment too long. For Prince Harry, that whisper came in the form of a rumor. A cruel, pointed remark allegedly made by a man whose title once commanded respect, but whose actions have stirred nothing but controversy for years: Prince Andrew. They were both princes of the same realm, born into luxury, duty, and expectation. But the blood that tied them together did little to bridge the widening chasm of resentment, betrayal, and silent tension. And now, more than a decade later, the silence has finally cracked. Prince Harry, once known as the cheeky younger son of Princess Diana, has confirmed a story many dismissed as tabloid gossip: a violent clash between himself and his uncle Prince Andrew that left blood on the carpet and trust shattered beyond repair. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The alleged physical altercation, detailed in Andrew Loney's shocking new royal biography, wasn't just a scuffle between two blue-blooded men. It was a collision of secrets, power struggles, and unspeakable truths buried beneath the polished exterior of the monarchy. For years, the palace had managed to keep this tale in the shadows. But now, as Harry breaks his silence, it is no longer just a rumor. It is a reckoning. What could possibly drive a royal to raise his hand against another? And what does it say about the family behind the crown when violence erupts not from outsiders, but from within? These are the questions that haunted the halls of Buckingham Palace long before they ever reached the ears of the public. And today, they demand answers. The details are staggering. According to Loney, the tension between Harry and Andrew reached a boiling point after Harry discovered what his uncle had been saying behind his back. Words, it seems, carry weight in royal circles, especially when they're laced with venom. Andrew allegedly warned others that Harry had gone bonkers after meeting Meghan Markle. Worse still, he predicted the marriage wouldn't last a month. For a man trying to build a life of his own outside the royal fortress, such words weren't just dismissive. They were an insult to everything Harry stood for. But the confrontation that followed wasn't just about Meghan. It was about years of tension, unspoken grievances, and a power structure that often left Harry feeling like a pawn in someone else's game. And in that moment, with emotions running high and resentment bubbling over, punches were allegedly thrown. The Duke of York, already tarnished by scandal, was left with a bloody nose. But it wasn't just skin that was broken that night. Something far deeper fractured too. Harry's confirmation of the story has reignited a firestorm across royal watchers, constitutional experts, and even ordinary citizens who once believed the royals to be symbols of dignity and restraint. What does it mean when those born into power cannot resolve their conflicts without violence? And why has this story remained buried for so long? Part of the answer lies in the unique and often suffocating culture of the royal family. Behind the palatial gates, emotions are carefully curated. Public statements are vetted through layers of advisors. Smiles are worn like armor, and silence is often mistaken for strength. But beneath the surface lies a family, not an institution. And like any family, it is vulnerable to jealousy, betrayal, and moments of raw humanity. The events that led to the infamous confrontation were a long time coming. Harry, growing increasingly disillusioned with the roles and expectations thrust upon him, began to pull away from the firm. Meanwhile, Andrew, struggling with his own tarnished legacy, was said to be resentful of Harry's growing global popularity, especially in the wake of Harry and Meghan's whirlwind romance. When Meghan entered the scene, it was more than just a new face at royal dinners. It was a cultural shift, a disruption of tradition, and for some, an unwelcome challenge to the status quo. Harry has since made it clear that Meghan was a turning point in his life, offering not just love, but a different vision of what his future could be. But for Andrew and others, she was a lightning rod. The criticism wasn't always explicit, but it was there: subtle jabs, exclusion from key events, whispers among staff. And then came the tipping point. The book paints a vivid picture of the final straw, a conversation that erupted into chaos. According to sources cited in the book, Andrew didn't just voice his concerns, he made them personal, calling Harry unhinged, questioning Meghan's character, casting doubts on their intentions. And when Harry confronted him about it, emotions exploded. Harry, not known for losing control, reportedly snapped. The details of the fight are still hazy. Palace aides have long buried such incidents under layers of denial. But what has now come to light is undeniable. There was a physical altercation. And for Harry to acknowledge it, to speak it aloud after so many years of silence, is a statement of extraordinary weight. It would be easy to view this as just another royal scandal, tabloid fodder meant to entertain or distract. But the reality is more complex. This is a story about trauma, about what happens when men raised in privilege are never taught how to handle conflict without force. It's about the invisible toll of tradition. And it's about a young prince who, despite all his advantages, found himself alone in a system that valued image over honesty, silence over healing. The fact that this story is coming to light now is no coincidence. Harry's relationship with the royal family has been frayed for years, especially since his and Meghan's dramatic departure from royal duties in 2020. Since then, he's peeled back layers of the monarchy through interviews, documentaries, and his memoir. Each revelation has pushed him further from the family and closer to his own truth. But this revelation is different. It's not about public opinion or royal protocol. It's about family. About a moment of violence between two men who once shared laughter at family barbecues and private chats on royal tours. It's about what happens when respect crumbles and rage takes its place. Still, the question remains, why now? Why would Harry confirm such a damning story more than a decade after it happened? Some say it's part of his broader mission to expose the toxic dynamics within the royal family. Others suggest it's a move to protect his wife and children from the narratives spun by royal insiders. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. A truth once buried has now been exhumed, raw and unsettling. And it isn't just about Harry and Andrew. It's about a system that failed them both. A culture that prioritized image over integrity. A family that forgot how to love its own when the cameras were turned off. Even more haunting is what this means for the future. If reconciliation is even on the table, how does one repair a relationship fractured by violence and mistrust? Can you forgive someone who doubted your marriage, questioned your sanity, and tried to break you with words? And if you're Prince Harry, how do you begin to trust again? These are the questions we'll explore as we dive deeper into this story. Over the course of this video, we'll uncover the layers behind that fateful altercation. We'll revisit the moments that led to it, analyze the consequences that followed, and examine what it reveals about the very heart of the monarchy. Because this isn't just a tale of royal drama. It's a story about silence, and what happens when that silence finally breaks. There are few things more complicated than family, especially when that family is bound not just by blood, but by 1,000 years of royal history, duty, and deeply rooted expectations. Behind the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, beneath the polished smiles and meticulously rehearsed appearances, lies a web of personal grievances, hidden power struggles, and generational trauma. For Prince Harry and Prince Andrew, these undercurrents would eventually become impossible to ignore, culminating in a deeply personal rupture that would spill over into violence. To understand the explosive confrontation between Harry and Andrew, one must first go back, far back, into the early years of Harry's life, where the seeds of division were first planted. Prince Andrew, the second son of Queen Elizabeth II, was once a golden boy of the monarchy. As a naval officer, decorated with honors, and enjoying the media's favor, Andrew was for a time seen as the dashing younger brother to Charles, the one with charm and swagger. But as the years passed, that luster dimmed. Scandals emerged, allegations began to swirl, and the man once celebrated became a source of unease. Meanwhile, Harry was born into a different kind of expectation. As the second son of the future king and the iconic Princess Diana, he was dubbed the Spare from birth, a role both protective and suffocating. Unlike his older brother William, whose path was clearly defined, Harry was left to carve out an identity in the long shadow of the throne. Early on, he was seen as the fun-loving prince, the cheeky lad with a bright smile and a mischievous gleam in his eye. But behind that image was a young boy dealing with immense emotional weight, made even heavier after the tragic death of his mother. The family dynamic was complex. Andrew, as the Queen's second son, held a senior role in the royal hierarchy. He had long enjoyed the privileges and deference that came with his status. Harry, on the other hand, often found himself navigating a complicated terrain of respect, resentment, and rebellion. To many outside observers, the two men appeared to exist in separate orbits. But within the confines of royal life, their interactions were frequent and often fraught with tension. Those closest to the royals have long whispered about Andrew's attitude toward the younger generation. Described by some as arrogant and dismissive, Andrew reportedly viewed Harry with a kind of thinly veiled contempt, particularly as Harry began to forge his own path. Unlike William, who adhered more strictly to tradition, Harry was unpredictable. He questioned authority, pushed back against constraints, and, in time, chose love and autonomy over obedience and structure. As a teenager and young adult, Harry struggled with the weight of public scrutiny. His wild years were splashed across the tabloids, nights out, questionable costumes, confrontations with photographers. Andrew, who had faced his own controversies, seemed less inclined to sympathize and more eager to judge. Palace insiders recall moments of coldness between them, subtle digs at family events, and a general air of disapproval that followed Harry through his 20s. But it wasn't just personal differences that fueled the strain. It was also competition, an invisible but potent force within royal life. Prince Andrew, despite no longer being in direct line to the throne, was used to a level of reverence and importance. As Harry's global popularity began to rise, especially after his tours, charitable work, and later, his relationship with Meghan, Andrew was said to bristle with discomfort. Attention, after all, is currency in royal circles, and Harry was cashing in on goodwill while Andrew's reputation began to crumble. The 2010s saw this divide grow wider. Harry matured, found purpose in the Invictus Games, and began to channel his pain into projects that connected with the public. Andrew, on the other hand, became embroiled in scandal, most notably his connection to Jeffrey Epstein. While Harry worked to build a legacy of compassion and service, Andrew found himself in defensive mode, his credibility slowly eroding in the court of public opinion. Despite this, Andrew retained a surprising amount of influence within the family. Protected by the Queen and shielded by the palace machinery, he continued to wield authority, particularly in private circles. This influence, many believe, played a role in how Meghan Markle was received behind the scenes. Andrew, according to several royal commentators and authors, was never comfortable with Meghan's presence in the family. Her race, nationality, and career background were all departures from tradition, and to a man as steeped in hierarchy and custom as Andrew, this was seen not as refreshing, but as threatening. It was during this period that the relationship between Harry and Andrew began to truly deteriorate. According to sources, Andrew made repeated remarks doubting Meghan's intentions and questioning Harry's mental stability. He was alleged to have told others that Harry had gone bonkers after meeting her and predicted that the marriage wouldn't last more than a month. Whether these comments were made out of genuine concern or malicious envy is a matter of speculation, but to Harry, they struck like daggers. Harry, who had long struggled to feel understood within the family, now found himself defending not only his choices but his wife's dignity. For a man who had watched his mother suffer at the hands of the press and the institution, the idea of history repeating itself was intolerable. Meghan was not just his partner. She was his anchor, his sanctuary. And Andrew's words weren't just disrespectful, they were dangerous. The palace, as always, chose silence. No official statements were made. No interventions occurred. The firm held its line, never explain, never complain. But behind closed doors, the tension grew unbearable. Small family events became minefields. Harry and Meghan's growing isolation was palpable, and in the background stood Andrew, untouched, unsanctioned, and unrepentant. For Harry, the message was clear: the system would not protect him. If he wanted to shield his wife and future children from the same suffering his mother endured, he would have to make difficult choices. And one of those choices, as the world now knows, was to walk away. But before that exit came the confrontation. Before the public interviews, the documentaries, and the books, there was a private explosion, a moment where all the bitterness and betrayal boiled over into something physical. And it wasn't in front of cameras or aides. It was raw, unscripted, and deeply personal. That fight, detailed in Loney's book and confirmed by Harry himself, wasn't just about Andrew's comments. It was about years of suppression, about a lifetime of being told to smile and wave while your heart breaks silently inside. It was about a family that often values protocol over protection, silence over truth. And in that moment, Harry reached a breaking point. The irony is that both men, in different ways, were products of the same flawed system. Andrew, enabled and protected for years, allowed his entitlement to fester into arrogance. Harry, denied the space to grieve and grow on his own terms, internalized pain until it burst outward. Their clash was inevitable, a symptom of a house long overdue for repair. And so, with a single, violent moment, a decades-long fracture finally became visible. A prince with a bloody nose, another with tears in his eyes, and a family more divided than ever. It wasn't a royal banquet or a formal garden party that lit the fuse. It wasn't the glittering setting of Buckingham Palace or the hushed corners of Sandringham. It was something far more mundane, an unassuming, closed-door family gathering, cloaked in formality but simmering with tension. On the surface, it was just another moment in the long march of royal obligations. But for Prince Harry, that meeting would be the quiet trigger that set everything ablaze. By this point, Harry had already begun his slow withdrawal from the inner sanctum of royal life. He had grown wary of the expectations, the invisible rules, the daily dance of pretense. Meghan was now part of his world, his anchor in a turbulent sea, and she had seen, with her own eyes, the cold machinery that churned behind the royal image. Their popularity with the public was still relatively strong, but inside the palace, support was eroding. The whisper network of courtiers, aides, and relatives had started shifting, circulating doubts, raising suspicions, and, as Harry would soon discover, delivering brutal judgments behind his back. It was during this routine family meeting, scheduled under the guise of logistics and coordination, that Harry learned the full scope of what Prince Andrew had been saying about him. Up to that point, Harry had suspected the usual coldness. He was used to backhanded comments, passive-aggressive remarks, and the casual condescension from senior family members. But this was something else entirely. The atmosphere had been clipped and professional. The kind of stilted politeness that made the walls seem to tighten. Everyone was smiling, yet nobody was at ease. And then it came. A whisper from an aide. A phrase carelessly repeated. Something Andrew had said during a private conversation. Harry's name. And then, the word bonkers. It landed like a slap. Bonkers. That was the word Andrew allegedly used. Not misunderstood. Not impulsive. Not emotional. Bonkers. Mad unhinged. A label meant not just to dismiss, but to delegitimize. And it wasn't just a one-off. According to the source, Andrew had been repeating that narrative for some time now, casting Harry as mentally unstable, a man led astray by his wife, a time bomb waiting to go off. He had reportedly told others that the marriage to Meghan was doomed, that she was trouble, that Harry was no longer thinking clearly, that the entire affair would collapse in a matter of weeks. For Harry, hearing those words was like having the breath knocked from his lungs. This wasn't coming from the press. It wasn't some faceless royal correspondent or anonymous critic in the tabloids. This was family. His uncle, a man who had once held him as a baby, who had joked with him at royal events, who had walked beside him at church services. A man who, even with all his faults, Harry had tried to respect. And now, here he was, weaponizing whispers to paint Harry as a fool. What made it worse was the knowledge that others in the room already knew. The way they glanced away, the subtle shifts in posture, the quiet clearing of throats. It told Harry everything he needed to know. The story had spread. The narrative had taken hold. And nobody had warned him. Nobody had stepped in to stop it. Nobody had told Andrew to stand down. He sat through the rest of the meeting in a haze. His fingers clenched into fists beneath the table. He tried to focus on the agenda, on dates and appearances and security logistics, but his mind kept circling back to those words. Bonkers. Not good enough for her. Marriage won't last. A spiral of doubt disguised as concern. By the time the meeting ended, Harry was no longer just angry. He was wounded, betrayed in the most intimate of ways. And as the attendees filtered out, exchanging half-hearted goodbyes, Harry stayed behind. He waited. He needed to see Andrew. When they finally crossed paths in the corridor outside the meeting room, it was anything but cordial. According to accounts reconstructed in Loney's book and supported by unnamed insiders, the exchange began with a question, sharp, direct, and utterly without pretense. "Did you really say that about me?" Andrew, caught off guard, reportedly didn't deny it. Instead, he smirked. That royal smirk, so often used to condescend or dismiss, now lit the fuse. He made a remark, perhaps meant to deflect, perhaps to provoke. Something along the lines of, "You've changed, Harry. She's got you dancing to her tune." Whether he intended it as a joke or not didn't matter. The damage had already been done. What followed was a confrontation years in the making. Words spilled out. Angry, bitter, laced with resentment. Harry accused Andrew of undermining him, of trying to poison the family against Meghan. Andrew fired back, questioning Meghan's intentions, insisting he was only looking out for the monarchy. The hallway, once silent, was now echoing with royal fury. And then, as tensions reached their peak, came the unthinkable. It's still unclear who threw the first punch. Some claim it was Harry, unable to contain his rage any longer. Others suggest Andrew pushed him first. But what is clear, what both the book and Harry's later confirmation agree on, is that it escalated quickly. Shouts turned to physicality. Hands raised. A scuffle. A blow landed. And when it was over, Andrew was left nursing a bloody nose. The palace walls are good at keeping secrets. Most of the time, these outbursts never see the light of day. But this one couldn't stay buried. Staff witnessed the aftermath. Aides were dispatched to mediate. The story circulated in whispers through the palace corridors, growing darker with each retelling. And yet, for all the chaos it caused, the institution did what it always does. It closed ranks, denied, deflected, buried the story beneath layers of protocol and press control. But for Harry, something had fundamentally changed. That confrontation, that brief explosion of violence, wasn't just about Andrew. It was about every slight he'd endured, every whisper he'd overheard, every time he'd been made to feel like he didn't belong. And in that moment, all of it came pouring out, not in words, but in raw, unfiltered emotion. It's tempting to view this as just a family feud taken too far. But it was more than that. It was a moment that crystallized everything Harry had feared, that no matter how much he gave, no matter how hard he tried to be part of the institution, he would always be seen as the problem. And Meghan? She would never be accepted, not truly. Not by Andrew. Not by the system. Not by those who still saw the monarchy as an exclusive club of tradition and pedigree. The fallout was immediate. Harry left that day with more than just bruised knuckles. He left with the final confirmation that he and Meghan would never be safe inside the palace walls. That the very people who were meant to support them were the ones undermining them behind the scenes. What's more tragic is that even after the confrontation, no real effort was made to repair the damage. There was no mediated sit-down, no sincere apology, no family intervention. The palace treated it like an inconvenience, an embarrassment to be forgotten. And so, the silence resumed. But this time, it was colder. Final. When Harry finally decided to step back from royal duties months later, those closest to him knew the fight with Andrew was a pivotal moment. It was the point where the possibility of reconciliation began to die. The point where trust became irreparable. Now, as Harry confirms the story and brings the truth to light, we're forced to reckon with what it reveals, not just about two flawed men, but about an entire institution that failed them both. The meeting that sparked the fire wasn't a one-time blow-up. It was the eruption of years of silence, pain, and betrayal. It's often the words spoken in private that leave the deepest wounds. Public criticisms can be brushed off, managed through carefully worded statements, or ignored entirely in favor of image control. But when betrayal comes from within the family, disguised as concern, cloaked in arrogance, it cuts differently. And when Prince Andrew allegedly branded Prince Harry bonkers in a conversation meant to cast doubt on Harry's state of mind, it wasn't just a slight. It was a calculated strike, one that reflected deeper disdain, jealousy, and perhaps even fear of Harry's rising independence. The word itself, bonkers, sounds harmless on the surface. A term often used jokingly, almost playfully, in British parlance. But when it's used by a senior royal to describe a family member, the implications are profound. It suggests instability, irrationality, and, in the context of a tightly controlled monarchy, unreliability. For Prince Harry, already feeling alienated within the institution, being labeled as mentally unsound was the ultimate dismissal. It didn't just challenge his choices, it undermined his credibility entirely. At the center of this storm was Meghan Markle. From the moment she entered Harry's life, she was met with curiosity, scrutiny, and eventually, animosity. To the public, she was a breath of fresh air, a biracial American actress who brought grace, eloquence, and modernity to the royal family. But to some within the establishment, she was an outsider. Her presence challenged centuries-old traditions, upset internal hierarchies, and, worst of all, made Harry question everything he'd grown up believing. Andrew, as described in Loney's book and echoed by insiders, was especially hostile. He allegedly saw Meghan not as a partner to Harry, but as a threat to the family's unity and reputation. According to sources close to the palace, Andrew was vocal in private settings, expressing concern that Meghan had changed Harry, turned him against his own blood, and was leading him down a destructive path. But it didn't stop there. He reportedly shared these views with others, senior royals, aides, and even staff members. He painted a picture of a vulnerable Harry, manipulated and irrational, making erratic decisions because of his infatuation. To many, it came off as concern. But to Harry, it was sabotage. When Harry learned about these remarks, it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the intention behind them. Andrew wasn't warning others out of love or genuine fear. He was poisoning the well, casting doubt on Harry's judgment in a way that would follow him through every meeting, every press engagement, every family event. And worst of all, he was doing it behind closed doors. Imagine living in a household where every move is monitored, every decision questioned, and every personal choice scrutinized not only by the world, but by your own relatives. For Harry, it was a daily reality. And now, knowing that his own uncle, someone with his own deeply troubling past, was actively working to discredit him, the emotional weight became unbearable. Andrew's alleged prediction that Harry's marriage wouldn't last a month added salt to the wound. It wasn't just disrespectful to Meghan. It was a direct insult to Harry's ability to love, to choose, to build a future for himself outside the rigid structure of royalty. It was a claim that painted their relationship as impulsive, fragile, and destined to fail. A narrative that conveniently aligned with the palace's desire to maintain control and tradition. But why would Andrew, who had enough personal scandals of his own, go after Harry with such venom? Some royal analysts believe it stemmed from jealousy. While Andrew had once been a media darling, his reputation had long been stained by controversies, most notably his association with Jeffrey Epstein. As the world watched Harry and Meghan rise in popularity, taking on global issues with charisma and authenticity, Andrew's position diminished. He was no longer the confident royal on a battleship. He was the man being escorted off royal duties in disgrace. In contrast, Harry and Meghan were commanding headlines, praised for their compassion, and drawing crowds wherever they went. To Andrew, it may have felt like a personal affront, watching the spare become the star, while his own legacy faded into scandal. There was also a generational component. Andrew represented the old guard. Entitled, deeply traditional, and steeped in royal protocol. Harry was something else entirely. He embodied change, vulnerability, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. That alone made him dangerous in the eyes of those determined to keep things as they were. Meghan, too, represented a new model of royalty, one that didn't conform, didn't stay silent, and wasn't afraid to speak up against injustice. Her mere presence revealed the cracks in the royal foundation, exposing outdated beliefs and structural biases that had long gone unquestioned. To someone like Andrew, her influence was destabilizing. In private, Andrew allegedly did everything he could to reinforce the idea that Harry had lost his grip. He cited Harry's emotional interviews, his discomfort with the media, and his growing disillusionment with royal life as evidence that he was not fit to make rational decisions. Never mind that Harry had served in war zones, led mental health initiatives, and built a globally respected charity. All of that was dismissed as irrelevant, overridden by Andrew's calculated portrayal of a man spiraling out of control. What Andrew may not have realized was just how deeply Harry internalized these attacks. Coming from the press or public figures, he could weather them. But from family? That pain lingered. Every cold glance at a royal event, every awkward silence during a dinner, every offhand remark behind his back, it all fed into a growing sense of isolation. Meghan noticed it too. She once described to friends that being part of the royal family felt like being in a fishbowl where no one is on your side. And Harry, who had spent his whole life trying to find his place within that world, was now realizing that the very people meant to protect him were actively tearing him down. This emotional toll didn't just affect Harry's mental health. It influenced every major decision he would make over the next 2 years. His growing protectiveness over Meghan, his refusal to allow their son Archie to be treated as a second-class royal, his explosive interview with Oprah, his memoir, his departure from royal duties. All of it was rooted in a fundamental truth he had finally accepted. If the royal family wouldn't protect him, he would have to protect himself. Andrew's words, now immortalized in a best-selling biography and confirmed by Harry himself, have become more than just gossip. They're a case study in how power is wielded behind palace walls, not with overt declarations, but with whispers, rumors, and character assassinations. They reveal the cruelty of a system that rewards compliance and punishes independence. And they expose a family where love is often conditional, and loyalty only matters when it aligns with tradition. What makes it even more tragic is that none of this had to happen. Had there been honest dialogue, family mediation, or even a moment of humility from Andrew, the rift might have been reparable. But instead, pride took precedence. Image was prioritized over intimacy. And now, two men, once bound by family, are estranged not just by distance, but by a violent memory that neither can forget. As we move deeper into this story, the question becomes not just what was said, but what it reveals. How does a man like Prince Andrew, with so much to answer for, feel emboldened to discredit a younger royal who dared to chart his own course? And what does that say about the hierarchy of trust, truth, and morality within the monarchy itself? For a family whose every public move is choreographed to precision, the royal family is often imagined as a fortress of calm, stoicism, and unwavering unity. But behind palace gates, the truth often tells a very different story. Politeness in public can barely mask the icy undercurrents that ripple behind closed doors. Royal smiles hide clenched jaws, and those glittering public appearances often follow explosive confrontations far from the public eye. It was within this atmosphere, tense, controlled, and suffocating, that the conflict between Prince Harry and Prince Andrew brewed, simmered, and ultimately exploded. In the months leading up to the confrontation, the air inside royal residences had grown increasingly heavy. Tension was no longer subtle. It was palpable. You could feel it in the strained conversations over tea, in the tight-lipped nods across corridors, and in the way senior members of the family seemed to avoid lingering in the same room as Harry for too long. Ever since Harry's engagement to Meghan Markle, there had been a shift, a noticeable withdrawal by certain royals, particularly those like Prince Andrew, who had long enjoyed the unspoken privileges of being a senior member of the inner circle. Harry, for his part, had grown noticeably more guarded. Once known for his light-hearted charm and easygoing demeanor, he had become more introspective. He no longer lingered after meetings or bantered during formal dinners. Instead, he often left quickly, retreating to private quarters where he could find respite from the whispers that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Meghan had noticed it early on and often encouraged him to stay strong, to keep his focus on what mattered most, their new life together and the family they were building. But it wasn't easy. The palace was not built for emotional transparency. Within its walls, feelings were seen as threats. Vulnerability was weakness, and deviation from tradition was, more often than not, treated as betrayal. Harry, who had grown up watching his mother suffer in silence, recognized the same patterns beginning to take root in his own life. And every time he tried to address the growing discomfort he felt, the system pushed back. Meetings became minefields. What once would have been straightforward family discussions about events or schedules were now loaded encounters, thick with coded language and veiled critiques. It wasn't unusual for senior royals to mask their disapproval behind questions that seemed harmless on the surface but were cutting in intent. Harry would be asked, with faux curiosity, whether he thought it was appropriate for Meghan to speak publicly about social issues, or whether he believed it was wise to continue attending events separate from the rest of the family. All of it presented as dialogue, but none of it genuine. Andrew, in particular, played a central role in these exchanges. He would sit at the far end of a table, arms folded, smirk just barely perceptible, and interject with pointed comments that were just subtle enough to escape reprimand but sharp enough to wound. To Harry, it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. Constant microaggressions, slights disguised as jokes, and a complete refusal to acknowledge Meghan's role or presence in the family. One senior aide later confided that Andrew often acted like the unofficial gatekeeper of royal tradition, pompous, self-important, and entirely unaware of the shifting world outside the palace gates. He saw himself as a protector of the old ways, and to him, Harry and Meghan represented a threat to that structure. Their refusal to follow the well-trodden path, their insistence on forging their own identity, was not just frowned upon. It was feared. In this toxic atmosphere, every decision Harry made felt like an act of rebellion. From the wording of press releases to the charities he championed, every choice was scrutinized. Even mundane scheduling decisions would be met with questioning. Why had he chosen to attend that event without notifying certain members? Why was Meghan meeting with grassroots leaders instead of sticking to traditional engagements? These were the questions that filled the palace halls, not out of genuine concern, but as tactics meant to isolate and destabilize. One particularly telling moment occurred during a family planning session for an upcoming royal tour. Harry had expressed a desire to include a stop focused on mental health advocacy, an issue close to his heart. Andrew immediately objected, claiming that it would overshadow other scheduled events and shift attention away from the monarchy's main objectives. The disagreement became heated. Harry, who had spent years working on mental health initiatives, was stunned. To him, the work was personal, necessary, and authentic. But Andrew treated it like a PR stunt, something unnecessary, risky, and disruptive. It wasn't just ideological differences. It was a deeper disdain. Andrew had never respected Harry's independent streak. And now, with Meghan amplifying that independence, the disdain had turned into something colder, more deliberate. According to those close to the situation, Andrew began lobbying senior aides and even members of the Queen's inner circle to limit Harry and Meghan's autonomy. He argued that too much freedom would weaken the institution, that allowing them to craft their own brand could endanger the monarchy's carefully maintained image. These power plays didn't go unnoticed. Harry began to realize that every move he made was being watched, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. Conversations he thought were private somehow became the subject of rumors in royal staff circles. Decisions he thought were agreed upon were suddenly reversed or delayed. It felt like sabotage. And at the center of it all stood Andrew, smug, protected, and untouchable. Meghan often told Harry that the walls were closing in, that no matter how much good they tried to do, it would never be enough for those who had already decided they didn't belong. And she was right. The writing was on the wall. Every tense dinner, every backroom meeting, every family gathering filled with uncomfortable silences, it all pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Their presence was no longer welcome. The boiling point came not in a single moment, but through a series of small, painful interactions. There was the ignored invitation to a private royal luncheon, the inexplicable decision to exclude Harry and Meghan from a photo lineup with the Queen, the abrupt change to security protocols during one of their appearances, and always, in the background, the whispered commentary from Andrew, planting seeds of doubt, stirring discontent, and reinforcing a narrative that Harry was unstable and Meghan manipulative. The royal family never confronted these tensions openly. There were no sit-downs, no mediated discussions, no efforts to resolve misunderstandings. Instead, there was silence. Cold, strategic silence. And behind that silence, a growing sense of betrayal. When Harry finally decided to confront Andrew directly, it wasn't just about one comment. It was about all of it. The gossip, the lies, the subtle campaigns to isolate and discredit him. It was a buildup of years of feeling misunderstood, sidelined, and, ultimately, disrespected. In the days leading up to the confrontation, Harry barely slept. He confided in Meghan that he felt like a stranger in his own family. that he didn't recognize the people he had grown up with, that the palace, once a symbol of duty and tradition, now felt like a prison made of gold. The final straw, the moment that led to blood on the floor and silence that would last years, was born out of this pressure. It wasn't a spontaneous blow-up. It was an explosion years in the making. And when it came, it didn't just bruise bodies. It shattered whatever illusions remained of a unified royal family. The grandeur of royal palaces often conceals the emotional battlegrounds that unfold within their walls. To the outside world, the British monarchy moves with grace, discipline, and an almost mystical restraint. Yet, hidden behind antique doors and centuries-old portraits are moments of such intensity that they would rival any dramatic scene from fiction. The night Prince Andrew walked away with a bloody nose was one of those moments. A confrontation that stripped the royal family of all its ornaments and left two men confronting each other not as royals, but as angry, wounded human beings. It didn't happen in the glare of public attention or under the watchful eyes of photographers. It was private, contained within the corridors of a royal estate, where only those with access to the inner sanctum would have any clue something had gone terribly wrong. According to sources later cited in Andrew Loney's controversial biography, the evening began innocuously enough. A scheduled gathering, a meeting that should have been routine. But nothing about the atmosphere that night felt ordinary. Tensions had been building for months, possibly years, but this night was different. The air felt heavier. Conversation was stiff. There was an underlying tension, barely masked by formalities, that hinted at something waiting to erupt. Harry had come with purpose. Meghan was reportedly not present, having been advised to stay behind and avoid yet another cold encounter with family members who refused to embrace her with sincerity. Harry arrived late to the gathering, not out of disrespect, but intentionally so. He wanted to have a word with Andrew, alone. He had spoken with Meghan earlier that day, voicing frustration, weariness, and a desperate need to confront what he had been avoiding for too long. The whispered insults, the private character assassinations, the open hostility, it had reached a point where he could no longer remain silent. Andrew, for his part, was unaware that the confrontation was coming, or at least he pretended to be. As Harry entered the room, Andrew was seated by the fireplace, chatting with another senior family member who quietly excused himself the moment the tension became obvious. Left alone, the two men exchanged a civil greeting, forced but not yet combative. What followed was not the explosion most would expect. At first, Harry remained calm. He asked direct questions. Was it true that Andrew had said his marriage wouldn't last? That Meghan had him under a spell? That he was bonkers? Andrew didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back and, with the casual arrogance that had defined much of his public and private persona, reportedly responded with a dismissive, "You've changed, Harry. Everyone sees it." Those words ignited something in Harry. The change Andrew referenced wasn't new. It was something Harry had embraced, a change fueled by healing, by growth, by love. But in Andrew's tone, it wasn't admiration. It was disdain. He wasn't saying Harry had grown. He was saying Harry had lost his mind. Harry's voice rose. He reminded Andrew of the years he'd spent serving the monarchy with honor. He spoke of walking behind his mother's coffin at just 12 years old, of the silent grief that had shaped his life, and how, even through that pain, he had always tried to represent the family with dignity. But now, as a man, a husband, and a father, he would no longer stand by while his wife and children were disrespected by the very people who should have stood beside him. Andrew interrupted, scoffing. According to those with knowledge of the event, he made a remark suggesting that Meghan was playing Harry like a fiddle, that she was using his trauma to pull him away from his family, to isolate him for her own gain. That was the breaking point. The altercation escalated quickly. Words gave way to shouting. Harry, usually so composed in public, was overcome. Decades of bottled-up emotion, resentment, betrayal, it all surged to the surface. He stepped closer, eyes locked with Andrew's. What happened next is the subject of intense speculation. Some sources claim Andrew shoved Harry first, telling him to leave. Others assert that Harry took the first swing after Andrew made one final disparaging comment about Meghan and their unborn child at the time. Whatever the exact sequence, the outcome was unmistakable. A punch was thrown, a nose was bloodied, and the weight of that moment, the shame, the fury, the sheer chaos, hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one knew how to put out. There was no security presence in the room. No aides rushed in to separate them. For a few seconds, it was just two men, stripped of their titles, their uniforms, their rehearsed personas, engaged in a fight that had been decades in the making. And then, silence. Andrew, stunned, reportedly held his face, furious and humiliated. Harry, shaking with adrenaline and emotion, took a step back. He didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked out, not through the back corridors where staff might hide his exit, but through the front hall, where a butler standing nearby witnessed the aftermath but dared not ask a single question. Later, medical assistance was summoned quietly. Andrew refused to press any formal complaints, likely understanding the damage it would cause if word ever leaked. But the story did leak. Not publicly at first, but internally. Within days, staff members were whispering about an incident between the two royals. Some spoke of blood on a white linen handkerchief. Others of a door slammed so hard it shook the wall paneling. As always, the palace moved swiftly to suppress any official record. Damage control teams were alerted. Media leaks were monitored. And for a long time, the story remained hidden, but not forgotten. Harry went home that night and reportedly told Meghan everything. He didn't glorify what happened. He didn't excuse it. He wept. The fight had not brought him closure. It had only confirmed what he already knew, that the institution he had once loved, the family he had once defended against all odds, was no longer safe for him or for the life he was building. That single moment, a burst of violence between nephew and uncle, marked a profound turning point. It was no longer about subtle jabs or icy formalities. It had become physical, real, irrevocable. Andrew, predictably, told his version of the story to those close to him. He minimized his role, claimed he had only been trying to talk sense into a young man who was spiraling. But those who knew Harry best saw a different picture. Not a man losing control, but a man who had been controlled for far too long. The aftermath of the Bloody Nose incident wasn't a flurry of public statements or apologies. It was silence, cold, calculated silence. The family never acknowledged it. There were no efforts to reconcile, no accountability taken. Instead, the event was buried under layers of royal protocol, while the emotional scars remained. Harry, however, would not forget. In the years that followed, he carried the memory with him. Through the departure from royal duties, through the interviews, through the release of his memoir. And eventually, he chose to confirm what so many had whispered about. Because for him, the truth was no longer something to be ashamed of. It was something to own, to speak, to finally release. The days following the altercation between Prince Harry and Prince Andrew were cloaked in eerie calm. No public announcements were made. There were no visible signs of discord to the watching world. Buckingham Palace maintained its usual rhythm. Guards changed shifts with ceremonial flair, royal press releases flowed with carefully measured optimism, and appearances continued without a hint of scandal. But within the inner circles of the royal family, the fallout was seismic. Royal residences are masterclasses in controlled chaos. Emotions may flare behind gilded walls, but protocol demands that tempers be cooled, conflicts buried, and any break in decorum swiftly patched over. This time, however, the breach was too deep to ignore. Word spread quickly among the small network of senior aides and private secretaries that something serious had happened between the Duke of Sussex and the Duke of York. Though most details remained confidential, what could not be denied was that a physical confrontation had occurred, and it had left Prince Andrew with a bloody nose and Prince Harry deeply shaken. King Charles, at the time still Prince of Wales, was among the first to be briefed. According to sources with knowledge of the situation, he was not only stunned but deeply troubled. Charles had always viewed Harry as the more emotionally vulnerable of his sons. Unlike William, who often maintained a composed exterior, Harry had always worn his heart closer to the surface. Charles had hoped that, in time, Meghan's presence would help Harry find greater emotional grounding. But the incident with Andrew told a different story. One of profound unrest within the royal family's youngest generation. The Queen, too, was informed. At her age, and with her steady temperament, she had weathered many storms in her reign. But even she reportedly reacted with concern. Her relationship with Andrew had always been close, often interpreted by insiders as overly protective. The idea that her grandson would come to physical blows with her son was deeply unsettling. Yet true to form, the Queen's response was pragmatic. The matter, she allegedly declared, would be handled internally, with discretion and without spectacle. This approach, though consistent with royal tradition, did little to address the actual emotional damage. No formal mediation was scheduled. No apology was demanded or offered. The palace moved swiftly into reputation management mode. Staff were instructed to remain silent. No records were made, and the event was scrubbed from all official documentation. But what the institution tried to erase in form, it could not erase in spirit. The fracture was now undeniable. Harry, still reeling from the encounter, withdrew further from royal life. His contact with most senior family members became sporadic and strained. Scheduled events were skipped or quietly reassigned. He avoided palace corridors where Andrew might appear. When in public, he remained composed, smiling for the cameras and fulfilling his duties. But those close to him noted a visible change. The warmth in his eyes had cooled. His once spontaneous laughter was rarer, replaced by a guarded expression that barely concealed his growing fatigue. Meghan became his sanctuary. In private, she encouraged him to open up, to process what had happened, and to consider what it meant for their future. She knew, even before Harry admitted it to himself, that the altercation with Andrew had fundamentally altered his relationship with the monarchy. It was no longer just about outdated customs or conflicting personalities. It had become about safety, emotional safety, psychological safety, and the safety of the family they hoped to build together. Andrew, on the other hand, reportedly carried on as if nothing had happened. Among his dwindling circle of confidants, he spun the story in his favor. He painted Harry as impulsive, unstable, and increasingly unreachable. According to one aide who later left his service, Andrew mocked the incident in private, portraying himself as the victim of an unprovoked outburst. Whether this was a defense mechanism or a calculated attempt to control the narrative remains unclear. What is certain is that Andrew never publicly acknowledged his role in the breakdown, nor did he attempt to repair the relationship. This silence, both institutional and personal, deepened Harry's sense of betrayal. In the aftermath of the altercation, he had hoped, perhaps naively, that the incident would finally prompt a reckoning, that his family would confront the dysfunction, that someone, anyone, would step in and acknowledge the pain, the breakdown, the danger of letting resentment fester unchecked. But instead, the response was business as usual. The family closed ranks. Meetings resumed. Photographs were staged. Speeches were delivered. And the message was clear: nothing to see here. It was during this period that Harry began to seriously contemplate leaving royal life. The idea had been there before, lingering in late-night conversations with Meghan, whispered during long walks through palace gardens, simmering beneath the surface each time they felt the chill of royal disapproval. But now, it gained urgency. The thought no longer felt like rebellion. It felt like survival. Harry's closest friends described him as torn. He loved his grandmother deeply. He respected the institution, even as he questioned its rigidity. He didn't want to leave his homeland, his duties, or the legacy of his mother. But he also knew that staying meant continuing to endure a system that refused to protect him, even from his own blood. The Bloody Nose incident became a symbol, a moment that encapsulated everything that had gone wrong. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about what led to it and what followed it. The silence, the cover-up, the refusal to address the root causes of the tension. For Harry, that silence spoke volumes. Behind closed doors, advisors began to discuss contingency plans. There were whispers of a potential announcement, murmurs about a new arrangement that would allow Harry and Meghan to step back without fully exiting. But negotiations stalled. The palace wanted to retain control. Harry wanted independence, and neither side was willing to fully compromise. Andrew, meanwhile, receded further from public life. Not because of the altercation, but due to the looming scandal tied to his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. The palace was already under immense pressure to address Andrew's conduct. In some ways, this worked in Harry's favor. The spotlight shifted, but the damage was done. The brothers, Harry and William, barely spoke during this time. William, caught between loyalty to the institution and love for his brother, maintained a diplomatic distance. He didn't publicly support Andrew, but he didn't condemn him either. To Harry, this neutrality felt like complicity. He had hoped William would stand up for him, intervene, or at the very least, speak the truth. But as with so many things in royal life, politics triumphed over personal conviction. The Queen summoned Harry for a private meeting weeks after the altercation. The content of that conversation remains known only to the two of them, but insiders believe it was a heartfelt but restrained dialogue. The Queen reportedly urged caution, advised patience, and emphasized duty. Harry listened, but the decision had already been made in his heart. The fallout from the bloody nose incident didn't result in public scandal, not immediately, but it left a private scar so deep that it changed the course of royal history. It was one more brick in the wall that separated Harry from his family, one more reason why he and Meghan would soon board a plane and begin a new life thousands of miles away. In the aftermath of the altercation between Prince Harry and Prince Andrew, time did not heal the wound. It simply buried it deeper. For over a decade, the royal family maintained its impenetrable silence on the subject. Behind public smiles and carefully worded statements, the truth remained locked away. And in the palace halls where secrets go to sleep, this particular secret settled like dust over the furniture, unspoken, untouched, but always there. For Harry, the years that followed were marked by disillusionment. The silence from his family wasn't just avoidance. It was a clear message. He had crossed a line. He had violated the unspoken royal code that loyalty to the institution always comes before personal pain. There would be no reconciliation, no therapy session behind palace walls, no mediated apologies over tea. The institution, ever focused on preservation, moved on. But Harry didn't. He carried that moment, those few chaotic minutes of shouting and violence, with him everywhere. In the quiet corners of Frogmore Cottage, in every awkward family appearance, in the uneasy glances exchanged at formal gatherings. It was the silence that followed that did the most damage. The refusal to even acknowledge what had happened only solidified his sense of betrayal. It wasn't just about Andrew. It was about what the incident revealed about the entire family structure. The royal family, as Harry now saw it, was not a unit bound by love and loyalty, but an institution welded together by convenience, image, and tradition. No matter how deeply someone was hurt, physically or emotionally, so long as the press wasn't tipped off, the issue didn't exist. During this period, Harry threw himself into public service. He returned to his duties with mechanical efficiency. He championed mental health initiatives, stood tall at military ceremonies, and fulfilled his public roles with practiced ease. But behind the scenes, the wear was showing. He grew more distant from senior family members. Where once there was camaraderie with his cousins, there was now awkward silence. Where once he had turned to his brother for guidance, there was now a cold, respectful distance. His relationship with William had taken the hardest hit. Though William hadn't been directly involved in the fight with Andrew, his refusal to address it, his choice to stay neutral, or worse, to align quietly with Andrew and the institution, was a blow Harry hadn't expected. The two brothers, once inseparable, now spoke through aides or in clipped conversations that barely scratched the surface. They attended the same functions but stood on opposite ends of rooms. The unspoken rift became increasingly difficult to ignore. Royal events were the worst. Whether it was trooping the color or Christmas at Sandringham, Harry and Meghan often found themselves physically present but emotionally sidelined. Meghan, who had already experienced cold receptions from certain members of the family, began to dread these gatherings. She would describe them later as performances, grand on the surface, but cold and hollow underneath. The year following the altercation was marked by another shift, the birth of Archie. The arrival of their first child should have been a unifying event, a chance for healing. But instead, it highlighted just how fractured the family had become. Andrew made no effort to reach out. Other senior royals sent gifts and formal congratulations, but very few personal gestures were made. Meghan later shared with close friends that she was shocked at how indifferent the response was from certain family members, especially given the enormity of the moment in their lives. Harry, now a father, saw the stakes more clearly than ever before. He had grown up in the royal family, surrounded by duty and expectation, but also by emotional repression and invisible wounds. He didn't want that for his son. He didn't want Archie to grow up in an environment where love was conditional and protection was political. And so, slowly, the couple began planning their next chapter, one that would take them far from the palace gates. During these silent years, there were no public acknowledgments of the fight. The press remained unaware. The palace's media machine, skilled at managing crises, ensured that not even a whisper escaped. But within royal staff circles, the story lived on. It became something of a legend, spoken about in hushed tones during late shifts, referenced with knowing glances during family tensions. The phrase "that night" was all that needed to be said. What surprised many insiders was how determined Harry was to maintain his silence. Despite his growing distance from the family, despite the emotional toll, he never once attempted to leak the story or use it to his advantage. He remained loyal to a fault, upholding the very code that had failed him. Instead, he chose other outlets to express his pain. Through speeches, through his work on mental health, through subtle comments during interviews. In every public appearance, there was a layer of meaning just beneath the surface, a quiet plea for understanding, a veiled critique of the system that had raised him. The breaking point came not with another fight, but with the realization that nothing would ever change. Harry had hoped that time would bring reflection, that someone, Charles, William, even the Queen, would reach out to mend the fracture. But with each passing year, the silence grew louder. It was clear that the royal family had no interest in revisiting the past, no appetite for difficult conversations. And so, Harry began to write. His memoir, which would eventually become one of the most discussed books in royal history, was born from this silence. It wasn't a revenge piece. It was a reckoning, a way for Harry to reclaim his voice, to speak truths that had long been buried beneath royal protocol and public image. The story of the fight with Andrew didn't make it into early drafts. For a long time, Harry debated whether to include it at all. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't about scandal, it was about honesty. It was about finally breaking the silence that had nearly broken him. But before the book's release, Harry took one final step. He reached out to the palace, offering them the opportunity to comment, to reflect, even to dispute the claims. The response, as expected, was silence. No denials, no clarifications, just the same old wall of polite indifference. The silent years weren't just a period of distance. They were a study in how trauma festers when ignored, how wounds deepen when left untreated, and how even the most tightly bound families can fall apart when the only thing holding them together is tradition. By the time Harry and Meghan officially stepped back from their roles in the royal family in 2020, the damage was irreparable.